Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Today I've got a really easy project, and as usual, this project started on some scraps of paper. I'm going to leave a link in the description. One of the very first videos I ever made, I used rectangle 8.5 by 11 sheets of newsprint paper, and I made a quilt out of 8.5 by 11 blocks, and they all had a red and black flannel kind of cotton print going through the middle. Well, what I realized was if you didn't flip half of the blocks the opposite way, in other words, make a V shape out of two blocks, with rectangles, you could not get a reversible star pattern that would also turn into an O shape. To make that happen, you would have to keep track of half of your blocks going from lower left to upper right, and the other half of your blocks going from upper left to lower right. For today's project, that is why I decided to just do 8.5-inch square blocks. So my first step was to trim my newsprint paper to 8.5 inches square using my paper trimmer. Now I needed a triangle shape for the center of all these blocks. My Dresden template was not long enough, so I simply drew 3 lines across this cardboard, and then I cut out my own triangle shape template. First, I just drew a couple of lines by eyeballing them, but I decided I really needed to measure equal distance from my center line, and then I redrew those 2 lines. Now remember, this is a scrappy quilt. It doesn't have to be perfect, so I am really not worried about exact sizes here. I just wanted to make sure, generally speaking, this template would be long enough to cover an 8.5 by 8.5 inch square. I decided I would make 36 blocks, so they're 8.5 inches square to start, and they will finish to 8 inches square, making for about a 48-inch by 48-inch finished quilt. I'm using this beautiful red and black plaid with embroidered flowers on it. That is going to be my triangle. That is going to be my focus fabric for this quilt. So all I did was lay my triangle template on top of several layers of folded over fabric, and I'm roughly cutting about a 1/4 inch bigger than my little template. The great thing about this quilt, nothing is going to have to match, nothing has to be exact. Next, I went to my scrap bin, and because the last 2 projects that I've done with scraps, I used up a lot of strips. My strip stash is not very big right now. I don't have a lot. I did go ahead and pull out all the light toned strips that I had in there. I also picked out about 5 different fabrics from my stash to augment my strips. Now, why do we take a look at this in black and white? It's because my focus fabric, I want it to really stand out from the rest of my fabric. Once I had what I thought was a big enough pile of strips, I put my triangle of my focus fabric right side up on my paper. Next, I took a long enough strip, I laid it right sides together on the edge of my triangle, and I stitched a little bit more than a 1/4 inch seam. There are lots of options to use as a foundation. Number one, you don't have to use a foundation at all. I like to use paper just so I know how big my project needs to be. Some people like to use a muslin for a foundation and do quilt as you go as well. I like paper because it's cheap and easy to remove. The main drawback to using a paper foundation is you cannot do any fancy decorative stitching or embroidery stitching, or your paper will just be too hard to remove. If you do use a paper foundation, make sure and use a stitch length of 1.8 or less. After the first 2 strips had been stitched on my first block, you can kind of see how it's looking. Now my subsequent strips will be shorter. I thought I would want to chain piece these, so what I did was I cut enough strips to the right length to just sit down at the machine and chain piece. The bumps of those embroidered yellow flowers on this fabric made my stitch line go a little crazy from time to time. Once I separated this chain, I did press all those seams open. Next, I stitched on the other side of my focus triangle. And here I just wanted you to note, my triangle is not necessarily going to the corner. All I'm doing is making sure that the stitch line of my next piece is going to cover up any gap. And once again, I separated that chain and I pressed open all those seams. For the second round, I went ahead and pre-measured some strips, enough to cover both sides of my center unit. So 36 blocks, I need 72 strips. I went ahead and cut them out all ahead of time and then just added those to both sides. I found that the chain piecing was ripping my paper too much, so here you see I'm doing one side, flipping the block around and doing the opposite side. Next, I started round 3 and I was able to use some of my smaller strips. I did not pre-measure for round 3. Now it was time for the 4th and final round. I stitched on my smallest strips yet to the corners of these blocks, and if a corner needed 2 more, I went ahead and sewed on 2 more. If I was doing precision paper piecing with a pattern, I would probably leave this paper on until I stitched it to the next block. However, there's really no precision that's going to be needed here. There's not a lot of matching that needs to happen, so I am getting rid of this paper now. With all that paper removed, all I had to do was press flat those outer small pieces. With all the pressing done, it's time to trim these blocks to 8.5 inches square. So this is not a precision operation. What I'm doing here is using the diagonal line on my ruler. I'm making sure that the skinniest part of my triangle is running right through that diagonal line, And then I'm just estimating that it's centered out at the end. I'm making sure the 8.5 line on my left and my bottom are not showing any gaps. Once I trim off the right-hand side and the top side, I just flip this around, line up on the left and the bottom with 8.5 inches on my ruler, and trim the opposite sides. With all of those trimmed up, I now have 36 8.5 inch blocks and a lot more room in my scrap bin. Well, let's take 4 of these scrappy blocks and lay them out in a couple of different ways. So here you see I've got all the points going to the middle. And if we flip the points around to the outside, we get this beautiful star. Now let's take a look at this star in black and white, and you can see that red fabric in black and white just reads dark or black, just very, very dark. All the other fabrics, no matter what their color, they read a medium or a light tone. Stitching this quilt together is super easy because there are an even number of blocks, 6 across, 6 down. All I have to do is sew my blocks together in a V shape. So I'm sewing 2 blocks together so that red fabric makes a V in the middle. Now that the pairs are all matched up, I wanted to take you through assembling a row. I'm taking a pair that is a V shape with the red fabric and another pair that is a V shape with the red fabric, and I'm just stitching those together. I'm keeping those V shapes going the same direction. Now the tail end of this piece I just stitched on is long enough. I can flip this around and add my next pair. Again, making sure the V shapes are going the same direction. Once I have this third pair on, my row is complete. So to make the star that I want to make, I need to stitch 2 rows together in opposite directions. The only thing I'm worried about matching is the seams between blocks, which I am using a clip and the nesting technique to keep those in place until I get to the sewing machine. Now, one thing to note about these kind of strip blocks, those edges of your blocks are cut on a diagonal line, which means they could stretch a little bit. I'm not too worried about that for my purposes of a scrap quilt, but it's something you have to think about, and if you're worried about stretching or anything like that, you need to use pins extensively and be very careful. Once I had my 3 pairs of rows stitched together, I clipped those all together in place to attach them and sewed my last 2 seams. I really think this quilt is beautiful. I just can't say enough about it. I just think it's gorgeous. I think it'll make a great baby quilt for someone. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.